All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman here as always with Reload founder Steve Gutowski. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing all right, Jake. How are you doing?
Doing all right. You just got back from the annual NRA meeting this week. Broke a couple of good stories coming out of that meeting. If you want to explain some of the financial information we obtained, kind of update some of our previous reporting.
Yeah. So, I was in Houston for the annual meeting, and they hand out their annual reports at the annual meeting. They're not maybe the most creative names for these things, but, they're descriptive. And in here, in this annual report, there gives you the consolidated finances for the NRA. Now, the one thing to understand here is that the NRA is actually a conglomeration of like 8 different groups, I believe. And so most of the time, when you're talking about like the membership, that's the NRA, the National Rifle Association of America. And it's a 501c4, and that's what the membership organization is. But then they also have things like the Institute for Legislative Action, which is their lobbying arm. They have the Political Victory Fund, which is their PAC. They also have the Victory Fund, which is their super PAC. And then they also have a number of 501c3 nonprofits, which are more like your traditional charities that aren't allowed to get involved in politics nearly as much. And that's, they have the NRA Foundation, they've got the Freedom Action Foundation, the Civil Rights Defense Fund, the Special Contribution Fund, and these things do different. They play different roles. They do things like the safety and training is in the foundation, or fundraising for it at least. And so, when we're talking about the finances, we're talking about all of these groups combined in this particular report. We had an internal report on just the membership organization's finances that we published earlier this year. That was for the first 8 months of 2021. And so we got some of the information from that as well. But we also have, of course, a bunch of the previous annual reports from the NRA to compare these against. So they're apples to apples in a lot of situations here. But the bottom line is the group has lost a tremendous amount of revenue over the last year. $47 million difference between 2020 and 2021. And it's even worse if you look back a little bit further to kind of the heyday of the organization, which was only about 3 years ago, where they had brought in $130 million more revenue that year than in 2021. So they're not doing very well financially, to say the least.
Yeah, it's sort of a continuation of the trend that we've seen at the last few reports we've done when we've obtained these. It's kind of the similar story. Oh, revenue's down a little bit. And we thought, that we did the 2020 financials, for example.
Or a lot of it, right?
Or a lot of it. Yeah, a lot of it's probably more accurate. But we thought, 2020, it's COVID. A lot of organizations struggled financially. So maybe that doesn't tell us too much. But then we got the leaked internal document that you obtained that we reported on that showed 8 months of 2021. And it was the same story. And now you've got the consolidated financial report for all of 2021. And it really just lays it out there that, revenue is really dwindling. So it's definitely an identification of a real trend.
I mean, it's obviously, it's obviously a little ironic or weird to call a $282 million organization, shrinking or in collapse, but that's really what's going on. That used to be a $400 million organization.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that the NRA has managed to forestall any sort of immediate financial disaster here, but they've done that by slashing spending across the board. Nearly across the board. We'll get that in a minute. But they've cut $43 million from their total expenses over the last year. And that's down actually $177 million from 2018. So their revenue fell 130 million, but their spending dropped 177 million. So they actually came out in the black and had a significant cushion there, about $30 million, where they could have lost even more revenue or could still lose more revenue and not be in immediate financial distress from it. So I don't know. They still have room to shrink, I guess, is the takeaway there.
Sure.
I don't know. It's not necessarily a very positive takeaway, but that is a takeaway.
Sure. And, it is kind of troubling, though, despite the cushion, the fact that they're slashing spending, which is usually on programs, the thing that members enjoy from the organization. But their membership dues are declining. You report here that just in 2021 alone, they lost 22 million in membership dues. So if you're not spending on the things that members care about and you're already seeing a decline in membership revenue, does that exacerbate going forward? Because members say, well, there's less and less benefits for me. Maybe I'm going to stop contributing. So it could spell problems for them in the future for sure.
Yeah, that number's down 73 million since 2018. So they've had a humongous drop in that time period in just 3 years in membership dues, which is a huge driver of their revenue, in addition to contributions. But yeah, I mean, we spoke to Brian Mittendorf, who's an accounting professor at Ohio State University, who's followed the NRA's finances for a number of years. And yeah, that's exactly what he noted, that this could turn into a death spiral, because if you're cutting services for members, then it's likely, or at least possible, that members will no longer continue to pay you to be members, right? It's sort of a basic concept, but that's what you're seeing. It seems to be some pretty good evidence that we have here in this report, and then in another one we'll talk about in a minute, that the membership is no longer as engaged as they were. And it's very significant, the drop off that there's been. But one area there hasn't been a drop off, right, is in legal spending, and a specific kind of legal spending, right? This isn't the spending on cases like the one before the Supreme Court, although the NRA is funding that one, to be clear. So they are still doing, it's not as though they aren't doing anything inside of their mission, just to be crystal clear on that point. But their spending on administrative legal fees is now up to $48 million in 2021. Yeah. That's an increase of $6 million, I think about $6 million from the previous year. And it's now their top single line item budget. And their top single line item expense in their entire budget is administrative legal fees, legal tax and audit fees. And that is incredible. I mean, they're spending more on their lawyers to defend them in the New York AG case and some of the other legal fights they've gotten into, like the one with their former top contractor, Ackerman McQueen, than they're spending on anything else they do. Right.
And that speaks to, again, the point where if all your expenses are going just to covering your rear end in court cases, start to look a little less appealing to prospective members, perhaps. And that becomes a problem. I think you have a members piece about this. That becomes a problem when big political fights come up, where members usually turn to the NRA to be the most active and spend the most. You have a great point in here about their School Shield program. If you want to highlight what they're putting out in that, because obviously that's very topical right now. We just had a terrible school shooting, and that's their flagship program to deal with school shootings, and they're not really spending a lot on it.
And that's the program that Wayne touted during the leadership forum at the annual meeting as their answer for school shootings. That they want to effectively, it's a program that helps harden schools, helps train schools in how to make their facilities harder for somebody to attack. They also advocate for putting armed guards who are, not teachers necessarily, but usually the NRA is advocating for, trained armed guards like police or former military people. But anyway, this is the program they put up as their main answer for what to do about something like the Uvalde shooting.
Right.
And according to the document we published earlier this year, this internal document that gives a little bit more specific insight into their individual programs, whereas the annual report just gives a more broad overview of what they're doing. But that document showed they'd spent $13,900 for the first 8 months of 2021 on their school shield program.
Right.
I mean, it's not clear what that would even amount to. You obviously can't pay a staff person, even a single staff person, $13,000 in 8 months. So I don't know what that money went towards, but obviously this is not a program that is anywhere near a priority for the NRA. And it's just one of many that's seen really cuts that take it all the way down to the bone.
Right.
There's just nothing left there. Maybe they've ramped up the spending on it since then. We don't know, of course, at this point, but that was last year. So it obviously it raises a lot of questions about what they're doing with their money. They're spending $48 million a year on administrative legal fees, $13,000 on school safety programs.
Right.
I don't know.
Yep. And it speaks to maybe, a little bit of, if, like we said before, if there's not putting out those things that members care about or that people see use in, you could see a declining enthusiasm for the group. And you saw maybe a little bit of evidence for that in another piece you wrote about just overall attendance at this year's NRA annual meeting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and all right, well, let's start off with the numbers and then I'll give you a little bit of a caveat here. So the 2020 conference that just happened in Houston, that saw, according to the NRA, they announced this at their board meeting the Monday after the conference ended. There were 61,254 people who attended. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is. It's still a lot. Like no other gun group could put together a conference like the NRA annual meeting. It's just not realistic to think that. But that's the lowest attendance they've seen in 16 years for an NRA annual meeting. It's lower even than the 2004 conference in Pittsburgh. So, that's, even if you go by that number that they gave out, which the caveat there is that it didn't at all feel as though there were 61,000 people who attended, even over the course of that entire, 4-day event. I was there. I was in the conference hall. I went to the leadership forum where Donald Trump spoke. It was very empty the entire time. I've never seen an annual meeting that empty ever. And 61,000 sounds like a lot more people than actually showed up, frankly. Yeah. And to be fair, the protesters didn't seem that much bigger than any other protests I've been to at the NRA annual meetings. So, I don't know that there's been a great outpouring of enthusiasm on the other side of the issue either. But the NRA, certainly that event was very empty. And even compared to something like SHOT Show, the industry trade show that we cover as well, that I was at in Las Vegas earlier this year, which did see, a drop in attendance, it still felt a lot better attended than this annual meeting. And COVID was much more of a concern back during that show as well.
Right. It was in the middle of the Omicron wave. So the fact that people still showed up to that. Yeah. And especially, obviously, this was in the wake of both the Uvalde shooting and a few weeks after the Buffalo shooting. So you'd expect, typically we see a resurgence in gun politics coming to the forefront after these horrific mass shootings. So a massive decline, a 16-year low in attendance is not something you'd expect in the wake of an impending political fight. You'd expect the people that are really into pro-gun politics to kind of rally. But you saw it not in just in attendance, but you report also that during the board meeting, participation in that board meeting was also down. I mean, that's been spotty for a few meetings, right? But it
was participation in the elections, the board elections, which don't require people to show up. Although there is a component that, and I'll touch on that in a minute, but the election turnout, which is the NRA does their elections by mail ballot, right? So you don't have to go to the NRA annual meeting to vote in the board elections. But this year, 2022, saw the lowest number, the fewest ballots returned to the NRA and a board elections since, again, 2006 at least. We actually have access to nearly all of the reports on the NRA elections over the last dozen plus years. Well, I guess 16 years in this case, and none of them had as few ballots returned as this year until you get back to 2006. And back in 2006, they were sending 1 million fewer ballots out too. Right. So the percentage participating in these elections just is minuscule now.
Right. Yeah. And another development, and you didn't touch on it in this piece, but it follows up on something we reported previously. It was also Wayne LaPierre was reelected handily to be executive vice president. I think Alan West, who we reported was challenging Wayne, I think he only got 1 vote.
That's right.
So you see the grip.
Although I will say that 7 people abstained. That just didn't vote. Of the board members, there were 61 board members there of the 76 that the NRA has, which, again, like a lot of these board members don't even show up
right
to participate in running the organization. So, it's not that perhaps surprising that nobody really treats this thing very seriously, the internal governance, because the same guy's been running the place for 30 years.
Right.
How confident are NRA members that their votes and their voice are really heard inside of that organization? I don't know. I mean, looking at the participation, clearly not many of them feel that way, right? I mean, and then so there's a weird complication with the NRA and how it runs. There's 76 board members, as I just mentioned, right? 75 of those are elected on the ballot. It's a third of them every year, but 75 are elected by ballot by voting members, is what they're, the term for them. And that's about 2.5 million people, according to, this latest election report. They sent out about 2.56 million ballots. So that's how many people that's how many of the NRA members are actually eligible to vote in an NRA election right now. Now that might sound weird, right? Because the NRA has over 4.5 million members, somewhere below 5 million, according to the internal documents we've referenced earlier. But why can't the other 2 million vote in that way? Well, you have to be either a lifetime member or a member for 5 consecutive years before you can vote in those board elections through the ballot. So New York has my understanding is that New York has a regulation that says membership organizations need to have the ability for all of their members to have a voice in their internal governance. So the way the NRA complies with that is to have a 76th board member, which is elected by members at the annual meeting, right? Hopefully this makes sense to people following, but so that other 2 million members or so, the only way they only have one person representing all of them on the NRA board, for one. And the only way they can actually participate in their election is by attending the annual meeting, which usually sees around 80,000 or more people. This year, obviously, it was much lower, but even so, 61,000 people attended this year, and only 544, I believe.
Yeah, 544.
544 actually cast a ballot in that 76th board member election. So, that those 544 people get to decide the one board member that's representing like 2 million
right.
of the NRA's members. So, it's just further evidence of how disengaged the membership has become at this point.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. You're seeing declining attendance, declining participation in the elections. And as you said, why would they? If, the same guy's been running things, he of course got reelected again handily.
Yeah.
It just sort of speaks to an overall trend. So we'll have to.
It does.
See.
I mean, these are institutional issues that go beyond the immediate problems of the corruption allegations, and perhaps explain why those sorts of activities were allowed to happen in the first place, because there's just not a lot of governance and not a lot of oversight by the members of this membership organization. And to be fair to the members, it's very difficult to provide that oversight given the way that the organization is structured. So